We think of capitalism as an economic system built on competition. Competition is good in theory because it forces firms to do what their customers want them to. Competition is held to be the opposite of monopoly. No one can control a market if there's competition. Why then is our world characterized by monopolies and oligopolies? This video is about a few of the ways the capitalist system encourages and rewards monopoly. I'm Chris, and welcome to Series 5 of It Had to Be Said, the season where it finally gets good. So the bad news is we live under capitalism. The good news is you've found the right channel to help you come to grips with it. As I explained by quoting Ellen Meiksins-Wood 3 videos ago, capitalism is an economic system based on the laws of competition, profit maximization, and capital accumulation. I spend half my time on this channel explaining what all that means in practice, so, subscribe? I used to assume the biggest and most successful firms, the winners, win because they provide, the best products and services or the best value, or they innovate the best. Until I started studying political economy and the history of capitalism, I thought because of competition, capitalism was the cure for monopolies. Just like no political party could possibly turn tyrannical if there are other parties contesting elections. Well, we're all naive until we learn, right? Today, markets are dominated by large firms that don't have to make a better product or lower their prices. In fact, they do the opposite. Deliberately design products so they'll break, and raise prices whenever they think they can get away with it. You might have seen this image or a similar one on the internet. I don't know if it's up to date, but it paints a picture of a market dominated by an oligopoly. Well, nowadays, that's most markets. We just don't have graphics for all of them. In fact, the internet, only 25 years ago a highly competitive marketplace, nowadays is mostly owned by 3 companies: Google or Alphabet, Meta, and Amazon. Is this how capitalism is supposed to work? There's never been perfect competition under capitalism. The idea is purely theoretical. If that's what people mean by free markets, that everyone's competing on a more or less level playing field, then there have never been free markets under capitalism. Not in its early days, which I go into in this series, and we'll touch on later in this video. Not during the golden age of progressivism a century ago, which you can read about in these books, and least of all today. That said, though you can identify monopoly or oligopoly in almost any industry, it's rare that firms have no competitors. They might just be local or catering to a niche. Like most things presented to us as the 2 choices, in the real world, competition and monopoly exist on a spectrum. For example, is Amazon a monopoly? On the one hand, it's pretty hard to own all of retail. Capitalists, people who own capital, they're in competition with one another. Not all of them own stock in Amazon. If they think there's a chance they can make money by taking business away from Amazon, they will. What's more, Amazon's strength, besides its brand recognition, is it's online, which makes it easy to copy, which is why there is competition from smaller retailers. On the other hand, when I, or someone whose opinion matters, like the US Federal Trade Commission, talk about monopoly, we don't usually mean one firm's complete control of the market to the exclusion of all other firms, but firms that control more than 50% of the market and attempt to squeeze out competition with, as the FTC puts it, exclusionary or predatory acts. Capitalists broadly agree on maintaining the status quo, but again, individually, they're in competition, and the ideal is to own a monopoly. In a capitalist system, the state or the government works for the capitalist class. If a firm seems to be monopolizing an industry and other capitalists lose out as a result, the state might do something. And it does. In 2023, the FTC and 17 attorneys generals answered my question by suing Amazon for being a monopoly. A 172-page report details how Amazon dominates the online retail market, alleging Amazon uses various tactics to prevent competitors from charging lower prices. It doesn't say anything about Amazon working its employees to death, but I guess that's not an FTC concern. So Amazon acts like a monopoly, but isn't that the point of playing the capitalist game? If you win the game, you're rewarded with control of the market. Competition isn't the cure for monopoly. Competition leads to monopoly. In the world of some economists, there exists a kind of equilibrium of forces in a capitalist market that keeps prices low and makes firms constantly improve the quality of what they provide. And that's because economics is largely about justifying the status quo with words and charts. If you look at how capitalism actually works, you can see competition regularly churns out winners and losers. Actually, that's true of all types of competition, if I'm not mistaken. Joseph Schumpeter, who was also an economist, but let's not hold that against him, popularized calling this process creative destruction, which has been praised as what's so great about capitalism because it produces innovation, when in practice it also means waste, bankruptcy, unemployment, and more power in the hands of the winners. When a firm loses, it goes out of business, which means one less competitor. In theory, that opens up space in the market where other firms can enter, but it might take them years to build up the customer base and brand recognition necessary just to break even. And most people can't afford to work at a job they're losing money on. So a firm loses and it's out of the market, right? Well, not exactly, because often the losers are acquired by the winners, and at a cheaper rate than the losers paid initially. The firms being acquired don't even have to have lost, as long as they provide the acquiring firm with a greater share of the market. So as a result of creative destruction, successful firms keep getting bigger, squeezing out the competition and cementing their dominance of the market. In a free society where there are no firms and states owning everything for themselves, there would still be creative destruction because people would still research and create. In fact, if they were free, they could create whatever they wanted as opposed to whatever the market will pay for. But the destruction part would just be of outdated ideas and technology, not people's lives. But we don't live in a free society. We live in a world ruled by states on behalf of corporations. Have you ever heard, "What's good for GM is good for America"? I looked it up. It comes from Charles Wilson, president of General Motors, during Senate hearings on whether or not to confirm Wilson, president of GM, as Secretary of Defense. Some senators took issue with the large amount of GM stock Wilson still held, about $2.5 million worth, and whether that would pose a conflict of interest with the Secretary of Defense position, especially considering that GM was one of the largest single contractors to the Defense Department at the time. He said he couldn't imagine a conflict of interest arising because he thought what was good for our company was good for General Motors, and vice versa. Maybe it was just a clever response to a tough question. But it revealed the very close relationship between corporation and state. To understand monopoly, we need to understand the state. The state is, in fact, a bunch of monopolies. It's a monopoly on making and enforcing laws and administering punishment to the non-compliant. It's a monopoly on the territory it claims, which means, at least on paper, the state imposes its laws on all the people under its rule. It claims a monopoly on the land and therefore the resources within its borders. Nowadays, the state leases out a lot of that land, granting the people who pay the most the exclusive right to tear up the earth for resources. Some land goes to landlords, some to big corporations, which these days are sometimes the same thing. Now, I don't know the history of every industry or any industry, but can you think of any that aren't monopolies or oligopolies, with a few large firms that dominate and get special protection from the state? Being so concentrated makes it easy for corporations to lobby the state to pass favorable laws. That's pretty much why we have standing legislatures. The state intervenes into the market every day. They pass various laws and regulations to serve the winners and discourage potential players from even joining the game in the first place. Why enter a market when the odds of success are stacked against you? I mean, would you want to join a game of soccer if you had to play against Brazil? In this analogy, the Brazilian team is a big corporation with a well-funded lobby. Open Secrets reported $4 billion spent on lobbying in the US in 2022. Our so-called representatives meet with lobbyists from every industry. What do you think they do together? Well, we know some billionaires gave some of the most powerful people in the government lavish vacations and property so they'd block a tax on wealth, so that gives us a clue. You'll know from having read these books in the past 5 minutes the value of regulations passed at the behest of the firms supposedly being regulated. Why lobby? Because that's how to get rich without having to improve. For people who think this is some modern anomaly and there's a kind of state that can work for the people, I'm sorry, but there isn't. States, even the state you like, exist and operate for the most powerful people in society. Their interests are usually in conflict with the people they rule. It might not be in your interest to subsidize oil companies or prevent new doctors from entering the market, but the decision makers don't have to answer to you. The state is also a monopoly on handing out patents, which grant monopolies. You patent something so no one else is allowed to use it without your permission. It's just yours for decades. If there's no substitute for what you sell, you can charge pretty much anything. I want to say how many millions of people around the world have died just because they couldn't afford life-saving drugs, but I don't know how to calculate it. But when even the World Economic Forum calls you out for monopolistic practices, you know you've gone too far. I don't think it's accurate to say patents are necessary for innovation. If I'm Mr. Pfizer and I patent a drug and I call it IH2BS, which helps against potentially fatal hadtibitis, now I have a patent, I don't have to innovate anymore, because now I have a monopoly on this drug. If you can come up with a better formula, go ahead, but you might need teams of researchers, in which case you're probably another big corporation or a smaller firm working for a bigger one. So when it hits the market, your drug isn't likely to cost much less than mine. We're an oligopoly. And I might just get a university to do the heavy lifting on the research and then patent what they come up with. I might have to give a bit back to the university in royalties, but at least I didn't have to pay the people who did the work. Then when I charge huge amounts for the new drug, I'll insist we have to charge that much to cover the costs of all the R&D we do. If you can't afford the drug, sorry, guess you'll have to die. When you die because the property says so, that's called structural violence. Do you need insulin? You're being gouged by structural violence. Insulin used to be free. Then capitalism happened to it. When inventor Frederick Banting discovered insulin in 1923, he refused to put his name on the patent. He felt it was unethical for a doctor to profit from a discovery that would save lives. Banting's co-inventors James Collip and Charles Best sold the insulin patent to the University of Toronto for a mere $1. They wanted everyone who needed their medication to be able to afford it. Today, Banting and his colleagues would be spinning in their graves. Their drug, which many of the 30 million Americans with diabetes rely on, has become the poster child for pharmaceutical price gouging. It's so bad 1 in 4 people with diabetes are now skimping on or skipping life-saving doses. People think the obvious solution to all this is for the state to regulate business, but it already does. There are thousands of regulations governing each industry. That regulatory regime is what led to this situation. And we still haven't talked about the pharmaceutical industry's ace in the hole, the war on drugs. The war on drugs is a protectionist measure. I won't go into detail in this video because I explain it all in the one I'm pointing to. Should be there. And I'll put a link in the description. But to sum it up, drugs are criminalized and the trade is policed so heavily because imprisoning and killing your competition on the taxpayer's dollar might be necessary to maintain your monopoly. The state and its violence have always been an integral part of the capitalist system. When monopolies or oligopolies control industries, they can amass huge amounts of wealth, and with it, influence over the state. The state has expanded the scope of its power and operations in line with the wishes of the wealthy, though it also has a measure of autonomy from them, and it can expand for a variety of purposes. The main drivers of the past 500 years of history have been slavery, colonialism, imperialism, and war, usually carried out either by business interests directly or states acting on their behalf. Force is how capitalism spreads. People who want to continue owning their resources resist the expansion of capitalist property relations, where whoever has the most money owns the resources. Once capitalists feel they've taken everything they can at home, they want to invest abroad. But they might need the help of the state. If you want your money to grow past a certain point, you need people working for you who can overpower and enslave people in other parts of the world. Let's look for examples down memory lane. There's the British East India Company, formed in 1600, which colonized large territories and populations all over Asia. The Dutch East India Company was formed by a merger in 1602 and granted a monopoly on trade in Asia, and also had colonies all over Asia. That's not to be confused with the Dutch West India Company, which had a monopoly on trade in the Dutch West Indies and the Dutch Atlantic slave trade, or of course the French East India Company, or the Swedish East India Company. Notice most of these companies were chartered as monopolies to compete with other monopolies, because competition and monopoly exist side by side. Now, I don't know Indian history, so I'll have to take Wikipedia's word for it, but did you know tens of millions of people starved to death in British India? How cruel an empire was it that there's a Wikipedia page called Timeline of Major Famines in India During British Rule? There were famines before British rule and a little afterwards, but British policy seems to have regularly turned unfavorable weather into disaster. Let's see. Monopolies of grain. Areas under British East India Company rule. Company rule. Whoops, that's the Irish Great Famine. How did that get in there? Totally unrelated. Under Crown rule. In Orissa in 1866, India exported more than 200 million pounds of rice to Britain while 1 million Indian people were starving. British India in the famine of 1896 to 1897, again the empire was exporting grain, and they just couldn't resist one more famine on the way out. Again, India's not my field, but it seems to me like the reason people went hungry was someone else owned their food supply. That's structural violence. Property is defended by force, so if people who have the means of force at their disposal decide something is their property and you can't afford it, well, you just can't have it anymore. But you can starve to death knowing at least someone else is getting rich. Now that most of the world's governments have aligned themselves with the US, or at least integrated into the global capitalist system, there's a lot less great power rivalry. Sure, there's a little, but just like rivalry among capitalists, states agree on the broad terms of the system they benefit from. They're trying to outrun each other, but they're playing the same game. As a result, we don't have world wars today. We have a few border-crossing wars like Ukraine and Armenia, and a lot of small wars. More powerful states sending trainers, bombers, or a few thousand soldiers, maybe to prop up one government or help with a coup against another. We don't colonize anymore. We just install obedient governments. People today say war, colonialism and imperialism aren't financially worth it because the state doesn't recoup the money it spends on going to war or defending colonies. But that was never the point. The state appropriates social wealth to spend it on private interests. War, coups, trade embargoes, structural adjustment, and whatever else it takes to subdue resistors are just policies well-connected people can select from to line their pockets. The US military has been at the employ of business interests for more than 200 years. Why do you think the US expanded to the shape it is now? Mostly it was slavers who wanted more land for plantations, using their power to get the US military to annex more land for them. Long before it finished expanding across the continent, the US was engaged in imperial ventures abroad. Since at least 1846, it's used its power to force open markets around the world, letting the highest bidder monopolize resources. Firms extract more wealth from more places and turn more people into landless workers, criminals, and terrorists. I can suggest dozens of history books for you to read on this subject, but you could just listen to Smedley Butler, a senior Marine Corps officer whose job was to break down barriers to capital expansion. In addition, there are many corporations that lobby for war because they make money off any war. They get state contracts to be sole providers at huge markups because part of the point of taking your money as tax is to give it to friends and partners of the state. Naturally, getting million or billion-dollar contracts vastly improves your position in the market. States go to war to create and serve monopolies. To wrap up, I know many people think the answer to the problems caused by capitalism is for the government to do something about the corporations. I don't think it works that way, and I think history makes that lesson clear. Due to the extremely comfortable relationship between corporation and state, I think it would be a mistake to try to use one to take down the other. Both institutions need to be criticized, attacked, and uprooted. I can do the criticizing part, and so can you, but we'll need to work together to do the rest.